The courtroom was dead silent, save for the mocking echo of the judge's laughter. High above the polished mahogany bench, Judge Archibald Vance looked down his nose at the frail, trembling man standing in the defendant's box. The man was Arthur Pendelton, a 72-year-old school janitor wearing a faded, oversized jacket with frayed cuffs. Judge Vance chuckled, a dry, grating sound that cut through the sterile air, and openly ridiculed Arthur's calloused hands, his stained work boots, and his low station in life, treating him like an invisible speck of dirt on the courthouse floor. But Arthur didn't flinch. Slowly, deliberately, his weathered hand reached into his tattered pocket. When he pulled it out, the glint of polished metal caught the harsh fluorescent lights. It was a medal, one of the highest, most revered military honors a nation could bestow. As the heavy medallion settled onto the wooden railing, the smirk vanished from the judge's face, his skin turning a sickly, ash-white. The entire room stopped breathing. They were looking at a man who wasn't just a janitor, they were looking at a ghost of a legendary war hero. Welcome back, everyone. If you're new here, grab a seat because tonight's story is one of the most emotional ones we've ever told. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far this little community reaches. Tonight's story is about pride, cruelty. To understand how a highly decorated, legendary figure ended up being publicly humiliated by an arrogant judge in a routine civil court hearing, you have to understand the quiet, almost invisible life Arthur Pendelton chose to live. For 35 years, Arthur was simply Old Artie to the students and staff at Oak Ridge High School. He was the man who arrived 2 hours before dawn, when the air was still freezing and the hallways were nothing but dark, cavernous echoes. He would push his heavy yellow mop bucket down the linoleum corridors, his rhythmic footsteps blending with the hum of the vending machines. To the teenagers rushing past him to get to algebra class, he was a fixture of the background, as unmoving and unremarkable as the brick walls themselves. They saw the gray hair, the deep, permanent creases around his eyes, and the slight limp in his right leg, but they never truly saw him. They didn't know about the agonizing nights he spent staring at the ceiling, or the nightmares that made him wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air in the suffocating silence of his tiny apartment. Arthur preferred the quiet. He preferred being invisible. After the horrors he had witnessed and the unimaginable chaos he had survived decades prior, the simple, predictable nature of cleaning floors and fixing broken lockers was a sanctuary. He didn't want praise. He didn't want pity. He had locked his past away in a heavy, rusted steel footlocker at the bottom of his closet, vowing never to open it again. He had transitioned from a world of fire and blood to a world of soap and water, and he was perfectly content to let the world forget who he used to be. But the universe has a cruel way of dragging the past into the present, especially when those who hold power believe they can trample on the weak without consequence. The catalyst for Arthur's nightmare came in the form of a wealthy, arrogant property developer named Julian Sterling. Sterling was a man who measured human worth entirely by zip codes, luxury vehicles, and bank balances. He had recently purchased a massive plot of land adjacent to the modest, rent-controlled apartment complex where Arthur had lived for nearly 4 decades. Sterling didn't just want to build high-rise luxury condos, he wanted to completely erase the neighborhood's existing aesthetic, which meant forcing out the low-income tenants who had called it home for generations. While most residents succumbed to the intense legal pressure, threatening letters, and aggressive buyout offers from Sterling's high-priced corporate attorneys, Arthur quietly refused. The tiny apartment wasn't just a roof over his head, it was his anchor. It was the only place where he felt safe, the only place where his memories didn't entirely consume him. Furious at the stubborn old janitor who was single-handedly delaying a multi-million-dollar development project, Sterling resorted to underhanded tactics. He manufactured a fraudulent property damage lawsuit, claiming that Arthur's ancient, poorly maintained plumbing had leaked through the floorboards, causing catastrophic, structural damage to the developer's neighboring construction site. It was a blatant, fabricated lie designed to bankrupt the old man and force an eviction. When Arthur received the court summons, he didn't panic. He believed in the foundational system of justice. He believed that if a man stood before the law with an honest heart and a clean conscience, the truth would naturally prevail. He had no money for a fancy defense attorney, so he chose to represent himself, arriving at the courthouse in his only decent set of clothes, a worn, decades-old tweed jacket that smelled faintly of mothballs. What Arthur didn't know was that the scales of justice in courtroom 4B were heavily weighted from the start. Judge Archibald Vance was not an impartial arbiter of the law, he was a cynical, status-obsessed man who frequently rubbed shoulders with the city's elite at exclusive country clubs and charity galas. He knew Julian Sterling personally, having shared expensive scotch and golf carts with the developer on numerous occasions. To Judge Vance, the case wasn't a matter of legal nuance, it was an annoying, tedious formality. He saw an old, impoverished janitor wasting the court's valuable time by standing in the way of progress and profit. From the moment Arthur stepped up to the podium, Vance made it his personal mission to degrade, demean, and utterly break the old man's spirit, completely unaware that he was playing a dangerous game with a sleeping lion who had stared down far greater terrors than a corrupt man in a black silk robe. The atmosphere inside courtroom 4B grew increasingly oppressive as Judge Archibald Vance shuffled through the legal documents on his elevated bench. He didn't look at Arthur, he looked through him, flipping pages with an exaggerated sigh of boredom that echoed through the high-ceilinged room. To the judge's right sat Julian Sterling, looking pristine in a tailored three-piece Italian suit, flanked by two slick corporate attorneys who smirked openly at Arthur's solitary, weathered figure standing across from them. The contrast was stark. Wealth, influence, and unbridled power on one side, an elderly school janitor holding a battered leather folder on the other. Arthur stood completely still, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, waiting for his opportunity to speak. He naively assumed that the evidence he had meticulously gathered, photographs of his spotless, well-maintained pipes and independent plumber receipts, would be enough to clear his name. When Judge Vance finally spoke, his voice was dripping with a heavy, patronizing condescension. He didn't ask Arthur for his opening statement, instead, he began to question the old man's very right to occupy the room's air. He scoffed audibly at the neatly typed, self-represented defense forms Arthur had submitted, tossing them onto the wooden desk as if they were trash. The judge openly mocked the janitor's occupation, asking him if he routinely brought the stench of bleach and school cafeteria garbage into formal legal proceedings. The corporate lawyers chuckled quietly, nudging each other, while Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, a smug smile stretching across his face. They believed they had already won, viewing Arthur as a helpless, uneducated old man who would break under the slightest psychological pressure and sign away his apartment just to escape the public humiliation. But as the verbal attacks intensified, something subtle shifted within the quiet janitor. The slight stoop in his shoulders began to vanish. His spine straightened, inch by inch, until he stood perfectly erect, possessing an unexpected, commanding physical presence that didn't belong to a defeated old man. The trembling in his hands ceased entirely. For decades, Arthur had forced himself to stay small, to remain invisible, and to let people believe he was just a simple, broken servant of the school system because it was easier than explaining the heavy shadows of his past. He had endured decades of being overlooked, bypassed, and ignored by a fast-paced society that only valued youth and material wealth. But being mocked by a corrupt public servant who wore the robes of justice was a line Arthur could not allow to be crossed. Judge Vance, entirely misreading Arthur's intense silence as fear, decided to deliver what he thought would be the final, crushing blow to the old man's dignity. He leaned over his bench, pointing a sharp, manicured finger downward, and stated that a man who spent his life mopping up after children had no business questioning the progress of multi-million-dollar city developments, suggesting Arthur should stick to his broom and leave the law to men of actual consequence. The courtroom held its collective breath. It was a display of pure, unadulterated cruelty meant to utterly shatter the defendant's resolve. But instead of bowing his head or breaking into tears, Arthur looked directly into the judge's eyes. The gaze was so piercing, so cold, and so utterly devoid of fear that Judge Vance froze mid-sentence, an uncomfortable chill suddenly washing over his spine. Slowly, without breaking eye contact, Arthur reached into the interior pocket of his faded tweed jacket. The corporate lawyers leaned forward, their smiles faltering, wondering if the old man was reaching for a weapon. The bailiff stepped forward instinctively, his hand resting cautiously on his holster. But Arthur's movement was calm, steady, and deliberate. He pulled out a small, heavy velvet pouch that had been tucked away near his heart. With a firm, unhurried motion, he opened the pouch and withdrew a brilliant, intricately carved medal attached to a vivid, star-studded ribbon. He placed it squarely on the dark mahogany railing of the defense podium. The heavy metal made a sharp, echoing clink that resonated like a gunshot through the silent room. The medal was the Congressional Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration for valor. It was an award so rare, so sacred, that by military tradition, even generals were required to stand and salute any recipient who wore it, regardless of their rank. Arthur hadn't earned this medal by cleaning floors, he had earned it on a forgotten, blood-soaked ridge in the dead of winter, where he had single-handedly held off an entire enemy battalion to save the lives of 42 wounded comrades, carrying them one by one through mortar fire despite a shrapnel wound that had permanently shattered his right leg. He had never spoken of that day to a single soul at Oak Ridge High. He had never used his legendary status to gain favors, wealth, or special treatment. But today, the medal wasn't a boast, it was a shield against tyranny. The silence that blanketed Courtroom 4B was no longer the heavy silence of oppression, it was the suffocating, paralyzed quiet of absolute shock. Judge Archibald Vance stared down at the mahogany railing, his eyes wide and completely locked onto the brilliant blue ribbon and the unmistakable five-pointed bronze star resting upon it. As a man who pridefully associated with high-ranking politicians and military elites, Vance knew exactly what that medal was. He knew that fewer than 4,000 Americans in history had ever received it. He knew the unimaginable, superhuman level of sacrifice it represented. The judge's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The smug, superior sneer that had been plastered across his face for the last hour didn't just fade, it completely evaporated, leaving behind a pale, trembling mask of sudden horror. Beside him, the two corporate defense attorneys looked at each other in utter confusion, their legal confidence instantly shattering. They didn't fully comprehend the military significance, but they recognized the catastrophic shift in the room's power dynamic. Julian Sterling leaned forward, his expensive Italian suit suddenly feeling tight and restrictive as he saw the blood drain completely from his judge's face. Sterling opened his mouth to speak, to perhaps urge the judge to disregard the old man's display and move on with the eviction proceedings, but a sharp, terrified glare from Judge Vance instantly silenced the developer. The realization was crashing down on the judge like a tidal wave. He hadn't just been publicly insulting a poor, defenseless old janitor, he had been viciously humiliating a living national treasure, a man whose name was etched into the sacred halls of history. Arthur stood behind the podium, his posture perfectly rigid, radiating the quiet dignity of a true soldier. He didn't speak a word. He didn't need to. The medal spoke for him, delivering a silent, devastating counterattack against every cruel remark, every mocking chuckle, and every fabricated accusation that had been hurled at him. The slight limp in his right leg, which the judge had earlier looked down upon with disgust, was suddenly revealed for what it truly was, a badge of honor. The permanent physical toll of carrying dying men out of a hellscape of mortar fire while his own body was torn apart by shrapnel. The calloused, stained hands that the judge had claimed brought the stench of garbage into his pristine court were the very hands that had held the line against overwhelming odds to protect the freedoms that allowed men like Archibald Vance to sit in judgment. The courtroom bailiff, a veteran of the armed forces who had served 2 tours overseas, was the first to fully react. His eyes welled with tears as he looked from the medal to the old man standing in the faded tweed jacket. Without a single thought for protocol or court decorum, the bailiff snapped his feet together, brought his right hand sharply to his brow, and delivered a crisp, trembling salute to the school janitor. The gesture was infectious. 2 police officers stationed at the back of the courtroom instantly followed suit, straightening their spines and saluting Arthur with profound reverence. The court reporter stopped typing entirely, her hands hovering over the keys, her eyes fixed on Arthur with an expression of deep awe and immense shame for having witnessed how he was treated just moments before. Judge Vance felt a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He looked down at the fabricated legal documents Julian Sterling's team had submitted, documents he had intended to sign without a second thought. Now, those papers felt like a radioactive liability. If the media got wind of this, if the public found out that Judge Archibald Vance had used his courtroom to openly mock and illegally strip a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient of his home to favor a wealthy campaign donor, his career would not just be over, he would be utterly ruined, disbarred, and socially exiled. The corrupt foundation upon which his entire authority rested was crumbling beneath his feet. The power dynamic had completely inverted. The man in the black robe was now the one on trial. Judged by the silent, unyielding gaze of the man in the frayed tweed jacket. Arthur finally broke the silence, his voice calm, low, and carrying a resonant authority that commanded the entire room. He stated that he had never asked for special treatment in his life, nor did he want it now. He simply asked that his evidence be looked at with the same impartiality that the law guaranteed to every citizen, regardless of whether they held a broom or millions of dollars in a bank account. He picked up his folder of plumbing receipts and photos, placing them gently beside the heavy metal. The contrast framing was absolute, the truth stood naked and unshakable on one side, while the elaborate, expensive lies of Julian Sterling stood exposed and pathetic on the other. The immediate crisis in Courtroom 4B had reached a stunning climax, but as Judge Vance sat frozen, a suffocating realization began to settle over the room: this was no longer just a simple property dispute. By placing that metal on the railing, Arthur hadn't just defended his home, he had inadvertently pulled back the curtain on a massive, deeply entrenched web of local corruption. If Judge Vance dismissed the case right now to save his own skin, what would stop Julian Sterling from using his immense wealth to target Arthur outside the confines of the courtroom? What about the dozens of other elderly, low-income tenants Sterling had already successfully evicted through these exact same underhanded tactics? Arthur's sudden reveal had bought him a temporary shield, but it also painted a massive target on his back, raising a dangerous question: how far would a desperate billionaire like Sterling go to silence a national hero before his multi-million-dollar empire was exposed to the federal government? Even more compelling was the mystery now swirling around Arthur himself. For 35 years, he had successfully hidden his true identity from everyone, including the school principal, the teachers, and the generations of children he had quietly protected. Why had a man of such legendary stature chosen a life of near poverty and grueling physical labor? What dark, unresolved secret from that blood-soaked winter ridge had driven him to bury his past so deeply that he would rather face public humiliation than reveal who he truly was? The answer lay buried in a rusted steel footlocker at the bottom of his closet, a secret that was about to be forcibly brought to light. As news of the courtroom showdown began to leak past the double-glass doors, a prominent investigative journalist was already sprinting toward the courthouse, sensing a story that could shake the entire state's political infrastructure to its absolute core. But the most immediate threat was sitting just 2 feet away from Arthur. Julian Sterling's face had mutated from a smug grin into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He was a man who unseated politicians and bought out city councils. He was not accustomed to losing, let alone to an old man with a mop. As the judge frantically tried to figure out a legal escape route that wouldn't destroy his career, Sterling subtly leaned over to his lead attorney, his knuckles turning white as he whispered a fierce, desperate command. They needed to pivot, and they needed to do it immediately. They couldn't attack the metal, but they could attack the man holding it. A dark, sinister strategy began to form in the developer's mind, a plan to dig into Arthur's military discharge records to find any piece of classified information, any hidden flaw, or any forgotten mistake from his youth that could be used to publicly tarnish the hero's reputation and invalidate his standing. The tension stretched to a breaking point as Judge Vance finally cleared his throat, his hand trembling violently as he reached for his gavel. The entire room waited to see if the system would truly correct itself, or if the sheer momentum of corporate greed would force the corrupt judge to double down on his initial mistake. Arthur stood calm in the center of the storm, completely unaware that the battle for his apartment was over, but the war for his legacy, his privacy, and his safety had only just begun. The quiet life he had meticulously built to escape the ghosts of his past was gone forever, shattered by a single, brilliant piece of bronze metal. The raw emotion in Courtroom 4B proves a timeless truth: true honor cannot be bought, and it can never be wiped away by a wealthy man's greed or a corrupt judge's arrogance. When Arthur Pendelton stood his ground, he wasn't just fighting for his own tiny apartment, he was standing up for every single person who has ever been made to feel small, invisible, or worthless by someone with a little bit of temporary power. It leaves us with a profound, soul-searching question that we all need to answer: if you were sitting in that courtroom witnessing Judge Vance's cruel mockery, would you have had the courage to speak up before Arthur pulled out the metal? Or would you have stayed completely silent, letting an old man face the fire all on his own? Type your honest thoughts down in the comments section below. I read every single one, and I want to see how many of you believe in true justice. This incredible story reminds us that we truly never know the heavy burdens, the hidden battles, or the heroic pasts of the quiet people we pass by every single day in our lives. The unassuming janitor sweeping the floors, the elderly woman waiting patiently at the bus stop, or the quiet neighbor who keeps completely to themselves, every single one of them has a deeply profound story etched into their souls. If Arthur's unwavering dignity and his ultimate triumph over corporate corruption touched your heart today, please take a brief second to smash that like button right now. It takes less than a second, but it helps our channel immensely by pushing this inspiring story out to millions of other people who desperately need to remember that honesty and integrity still win in the end. If you are brand new to the channel and you want to see more powerful, high-stakes storytelling videos just like this one, make sure to hit that big red subscribe button and click the little notification bell icon right now. By joining our growing community, you will never miss a single moment of our upcoming, deep dive investigations into hidden heroes and incredible, unexpected acts of justice. We have an absolutely massive video dropping next week detailing exactly what happened when the investigative journalist finally opened Arthur's rusted steel footlocker and exposed Julian Sterling's entire corporate empire to the federal government. Trust me, you do not want to miss a single second of it. Thank you so much for watching, keep standing up for what is right, and we will see you in the very next story.